My name is Frances Clark, and I am the program director of the Teton Plants, which is a chapter of the Wyoming Native Plant Society. On board tonight is also Amy. Gosh, my brain is on vacation here. Amy Taylor. Yes, thank you.
Hi, here I am. Hi.
And she's there. And Amy's been doing also the last minute details to make sure all of our speakers are in good shape for tonight, because we do have this wonderful panel of people from the Grand Teton National Park. And I'm just so thrilled that they're willing and able to do this with us. And we're hoping that we can have everybody on. And again, if anybody gets bumped off who's trying to get on at the last minute and we're over our 100, we are also live streaming it through the Nature Night connection at the library. And I think most of you were sent that information. So in order to keep us on time tonight, what I would like to do is introduce our three speakers and then let them take it from there. So hopefully everybody's ready and live on YouTube. And just so you all know, that will be posted on YouTube. So if any of you do not want to show your face or your name, you can still be up there and you can change your name if you want. Or just use the first name, as many of you are doing tonight. But then after we do our presentation, we will take your questions. We'd love to have those put into the chat as we go along, but please sort of, if you can, so wait towards the end so that doesn't become a distraction as the speakers are going. And then we will try to field those chat questions and put them out to the presenters, and or unmute, call upon you by your name and let you ask that question, because we'd love to have as much interaction as possible, given that we now have about 80 participants on our Zoom call here. Okay, so we will make sure everybody else is muted. But the other thing is, if you're on a screen, if you can keep your activity so it's not distracting if you have your video on, because some people like to look at all the faces. And so just try to keep your activity quiet. That makes a big difference. Okay, so first up in my list, and I'm not quite sure which way they're going to present themselves. The first one is Laura Jones. She is a plant community ecologist and branch chief of vegetation ecology and management of the Grand Teton National Park and the John D. Rockefeller Parkway. She arrived here about 2 years ago, and she's been involved with resource management, science, and planning with an emphasis on ecological restoration for a number of years. And just emphasizing the amount of teamwork it requires. She's worked at Yosemite National Park, Colorado National Monument, and the Boulder County Open Space. She grew up in Maine, and what she really likes is the problem-solving aspect of restoration. There's science that you can apply, but then there's just always an element of you just don't quite know what's going to happen. And that's part of the piece that she really, really enjoys. Eric has been in town in the area since 2010. He is now the lead biological scientist technician for the Grand Teton National Park and the Memorial Parkway. He specializes in the actual implementation of restoration projects and then monitoring their outcomes, which is sort of essential. Unless we know what actually happened, you don't know how to keep improving. He's worked on the program since 2010 and has previous experience, which is essential in native plant growing and production, and then also on invasive plant control. So those are all, the plants themselves, the native plants are just the beginning of a much more complicated process that really requires a lot of monitoring and getting rid of those invasives, as we will find out. And he and I were out on site with Dan Reinhardt a few years ago when they were giving a on-site presentation of the work they've been doing out at Antelope Flats, and it's been very impressive. And again, he comes to us with a lifelong passion on the outdoors that's included botanizing and just all the wonderful things that he's enjoyed being outside. Sienna Wessel is a master's candidate at the University of Wyoming and is the collaborating researcher here at the Grand Teton National Park. And she's dedicated to the restoration and conservation of native plants, yippee, and is working to understand how we can improve the sagebrush steppe restoration process under the challenge of climate change. And she's worked, has worked before in South Dakota. She's worked with the U.S. Forest Service, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, the Nature Conservancy, and it's always sort of come down to this restoration process that's attracted her, because again, she loves the problem solving. So I don't know about you, but I'm really excited to see what these three professionals have to say about trying to do a salute to sagebrush, restoring the native plant communities of the greater Yellowstone ecosystem. So I'm gonna let you guys take off with this now.
Thank you, Frances, and thank you, Amy and Leah at the library. Let me work on my screen share. How are we looking? Do we have a title page? Okay. Yeah, I really want to first thank everybody. We're really excited to be bringing this to you tonight. This project has been happening for many years, and it was really time to take a look back at how it was working and communicate those results to you. So this is a project you might know as the Kelly Hayfields Restoration, and we're now calling this the Antelope Flats Sagebrush Habitat Restoration to better reflect that goal. So 3 presenters today. I'll talk about why we're doing this, and then Eric will talk about what we've been doing, so restoration techniques, and Sienna, how are we doing? A glimpse at the monitoring data results. I'll pop back in for a minute at the very end also to kind of finish up and tell you where we're headed. Before we do that, I'm going to get you acquainted with a couple other people on our team. This is the core team that's working on the restoration. So you'll hear from Eric shortly and Sienna as well. But I'll mention that Sienna just started working with Eric and I last year to put together a proposal for a focused condition assessment. And that's to evaluate the restoration data. So that was funded, and that's how we're collaborating right now. But you'll also be joining us this summer as a Scientists and Parks Fellow. So we're really excited about that. Amanda Snodgrass is our Native Plant Materials Program Lead, and Janine, our Invasive Plant Program Lead. So they both began with us this past summer, bringing new skills and perspective, and they'll be really key in how we adapt our practices. So also, I say Amanda is organizing volunteers for plant work. So more on that at the end of the presentation. And this work was funded with park funds, in part are your fee dollars at work. However, we could not have done this without our partnership with the Grand Teton National Park Foundation, including grants from the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation, Teton Conservation District, and individual donors. And I'm just going to start with the NPS Park Service mission to preserve unimpaired the natural and cultural resources and values of the national park system for the enjoyment, education, and inspiration of this and future generations. The Park Service cooperates with partners to extend the benefits of natural and cultural resource conservation and outdoor recreation throughout this country and the world. I'm looking a little bit closer at land protection in the West. I have a few slides I borrowed from Tom Rodhouse and Jeff Lonecker of the Park Service's Inventory and Monitoring Program, where they just presented last December on operationalizing resilience and resistance concepts for conservation of sagebrush ecosystems in US national parks. So I thank them for letting me borrow some of this work. This map shows protection level status in the Western US. And the highest level of protection, I'll walk you through that. The number 1 is the most most highly protected, and that's in the darker green. Lighter green is another level of protection, and third is permanent protection, but subjected to extractive uses. So you see in the Northwest Wyoming, Grand Teton is here under the big square of Yellowstone. But notice that in Teton County and the surrounding lands, we have a lot of conserved land. We have a fair bit of protection. And the sagebrush biome, it's not mapped here, but it covers a fair bit. There's a lot of overlap with these Western states. And there's about 10% of that sagebrush ecosystems are in level 1 and 2 protection. And the NPS only contains about 1.2% of sagebrush ecosystems mapped. But so that's a low percentage, but considering its protected status, those areas are really important for conservation. And I'd extend that to beyond Grand Teton and our parks to Teton County and these surrounding lands. And this was just out last week, so I really wanted to share. It's a sagebrush conservation strategy released by the USGS. It's contributors from 34 agencies and NGOs on the importance of sagebrush and the change agents, including altered fire regimes, invasive plants, and land use changes. And all of these threats will be exacerbated by warming climates. And among other restoration or other management strategies, it really calls for extensive restoration of sagebrush communities in already converted or degraded areas. So that's something to check out. And looking closer at the change agents, altered fire regime, and invasive plants, which are related, the inventory and monitoring program, sagebrush monitoring, captured changes in vegetation structure associated with repeated fires occurring at the site in John Day Fossil Beds National Monument. In the top photos in 1987 and 1990, you see a sagebrush predominance. In the lower photo in 2012, sagebrush is missing. So they've documented a loss of shrubs, some native perennial grass recovery, and increased annual grass. This is inside a park unit despite its protected status. And this is just a light example, if you will. And many lands have been severely degraded due to conversion to cheatgrass and other invasive annual grasses. So this is clearly concerning, and land managers have been looking in a resilience and resistance framework. And that's, in this case, this is resistance to annual grass invasion and resilience to fire, the ability to recover to pre-fire structure and composition. So with this site, the sagebrush was of a low resistance type. It turns out there are factors that can predict resilience and resistance. Soil moisture and temperature and elevation. Higher resistance and resilience are correlated with higher elevation. So much of the sagebrush in NPS lands are of lower elevation and lower resistance and resilience type. And sagebrush here is in the higher resistance and resilience type. And in fact, this is a photo in the upper right of Grand Teton's sagebrush. And our former branch chief, Kelly McCluskey, in that photo, I believe. So, so given that the Park Service manages a small percentage of sagebrush and that very little is of high resilience and resistance, what we have here in the park and our neighboring lands is well positioned to likely have a positive outcome with our interventions and restoration. So that said, we are very cautious. There is cheatgrass in Teton County and other invasive plants. And while intact sagebrush has little to no invasive plants, which is absolutely amazing to say of any land, we have disturbed areas like roadsides, disturbed exposed ground, and some of our restoration area has cheatgrass. So we take this very seriously, and especially in the context of a warming climate where current conditions that underlie the high resistance and resilience can change. So we need to be vigilant and manage the land. But looking at one of the change agents here in Grand Teton, conversion to cropland, in the 1890s, homesteaders removed sagebrush and planted non-native pasture grass for pasture and haying in the area of Antelope Flats that became known as the Kelly Hayfields. To do that, they cleared sagebrush and native vegetation, built a system of irrigation ditches. So in the 1950s, when the area became part of Grand Teton National Park, ranching and farming was gradually phased out. Here you see a photo from Blacktail Butte looking east over Antelope Flats. In 2007, with the Elk Bison Management Plan, our predecessors had this visionary plan to restore 4,500 acres of former pasture to its native rangeland for the benefit of the abundance of wildlife we have here in the greater Yellowstone ecosystem. The NPS policies call on us not just to protect resources, but to restore natural processes. Our park's strategic plan, Grand Teton Next, marks this restoration as a key action to prioritize continued support for the restoration and education of the former Kelly hayfields. And finally, it aligns with the larger sagebrush conservation strategy that I just mentioned. So what's at stake? What are we protecting? This is sagebrush in Grand Teton National Park just yesterday. As the snow slowly melts into spring, we see the first plants of the season. This is sagebrush buttercup. It's the first plant I saw, the first flower I saw last season, not too long after this time of year. So the spring ephemerals will quickly emerge as the snow disappears. Steer's head, spring beauty, and yellow bells, other spring ephemerals that we'll see soon. Shooting star will emerge and flower not long after. Large flowered tritolea, which is a rare plant in Grand Teton National Park. Longleaf phlox. And by June, we start to get the arrowleaf balsam root, which is when the sagebrush really becomes showy and it comes to life. We have grasses, Columbia needlegrass, mountain brome, and squirreltail in the sage. Later season flowers like aster and rabbitbrush finish out the season. And finally, the star of the show. We have several species of sagebrush in Grand Teton. This is mountain big sagebrush. These plants host an array of insects and pollinators and birds associated with sagebrush. The greater sage grouse is a sagebrush obligate requiring sagebrush habitat year-round. The Jackson sage grouse population is limited by winter habitat, which is characterized by mature, exposed sagebrush throughout the winter. Much of what we've learned about sagebrush conservation and ecosystems over the past 2 decades has been from sage grouse conservation efforts. But sagebrush is also vital to the abundance of wildlife we have in the greater Yellowstone ecosystem. These sagebrush associated species, pronghorn and bison, which is iconic for the National Park Service. Grizzlies here foraging in the fall. Sagebrush is very important winter habitat for moose in this area. Much of the migrating elk population move through sagebrush and through our project area that's here in the map on the left in yellow. And they're on their way to the elk refuge, which is just south of the park. That's their winter migration headed to the elk refuge and then reversing in the spring. Humans have been connected with sagebrush ecosystems for thousands of years. Wildlife viewing and photography are top activities in the parks for visitors to partake in. And the likelihood of seeing megafauna is a major attractant to the greater Yellowstone ecosystem. This is Antelope Flats, just north of the project area. So to conclude, protecting and restoring sagebrush is really at the heart of the NPS mission. And I'm going to turn this over to Eric to show you all what our restoration practice looks like.
Thank you, Laura. Let's see, get my screen sharing going on. Stand by. Stand by, starting on the wrong slide there. Okay, how do I look? All right, thanks, Laura. So yeah, first let's take another look at the project location for the Antelope Flats Restoration Project. It's there in yellow at the south end of Grand Teton National Park. You know, and the green color, the darker green color on the map represents the sagebrush steppe plant communities in the area. You can see how the project area, you know, creates a significant void in a way amidst a sea of sagebrush. You know, that's a void in pretty large void in wildlife habitat, you know, over 4,000 acres. Now let's zoom in for a closer look. So here you can see a closer look at the project boundaries, which closely correspond with those areas that were converted to non-native grasses during homesteading of the area. You can see the area was subdivided into smaller units when the project began to make implementation more manageable in such a large area. Even though the grazing and the ranching here was phased out decades ago, you know, these areas remained dominated by non-native grasses and other invasive plants. Particularly, the dominant vegetation is a species called smooth brome. Now, why has smooth brome been able to dominate this landscape on its own for so many years? Well, it's because it's a very long-lived, perennial, sod-forming grass species. It has a very resilient system of roots and underground stems, so it forms a monoculture that completely excludes most native plants. It also has a very limited value as wildlife habitat. So how do we restore this landscape from that smooth brome monoculture, which is the photo on the left, to our reference plant community, which you'll hear me refer to that as the intact sagebrush steppe or the intact community, which is the photo on the right. Now, because of smooth brome's ability to persist on this landscape indefinitely, excluding the native plants, restoration needs to begin with active removal of that species. And we accomplish that with an herbicide treatment of glyphosate in the spring. And this step of the process usually takes 2 years because it requires a repeat treatment the following year to accomplish full removal. Really, the most time-consuming and complex part of the restoration process revolves around seed, which is sourced directly or indirectly from plant populations growing within the boundaries of the park in the sagebrush communities, and requires planning that actually starts well before that smooth brome removal and requires a diversified approach. You know, that includes hand harvesting seed from wild populations of plants. And we sometimes prioritize species based on their ecological functions. For example, as a legume, an ecological function of silky lupin is that it adds nutrients to the soil by fixing nitrogen. So that benefits the entire plant community. Here on the left is some of our staff collecting antelope bitterbrush seed with racquetball rackets, which probably has to be one of my favorite methods of collecting seed. And a bitterbrush is a shrub that's actually a critical food source for moose in parts of Grand Teton for certain parts of the year. The picture on the right, there's a moose browsing on bitterbrush in the Sagebrush Flats just near Ditch Creek. I'm sure you've seen all the moose out there in the fall or winter if you're around at that time. We also use some of the hand-collected seed to propagate seed outside of the park in a practice called seed increase. And the Grand Teton National Park Foundation actually helps us get funding for some of this seed increase, making some of that possible. We even harvest seed from already planted restoration sites. So after we have enough seed and the smooth brome is removed, we plant our native seed mix. And this is done in the fall, primarily with a rangeland seed drill, which is that yellow piece of equipment attached to the tractor. And there I am on the left, trying to stay warm in late October on the UTV with a smaller piece of seeding equipment. So yeah, if you see a big red tractor out there, give us a wave, because it's probably myself or one of our other technicians, and we appreciate it after a long day in that equipment. And the next spring after that seeding, seeds germinate and seedlings begin to emerge. This part really gets me excited. I'm kind of like a kid in a candy store running around out there early in the summer trying to see what's coming up. But once the native plants begin to grow, our job of restoration is far from complete. We diligently manage invasive plants each year on restoration sites to prevent major infestations and aid the establishment of native plants. There's Janine Foley, our invasive plant program manager. Hi, Janine. We also collect plant community composition data over time in each of the restoration sites. This is extremely important to help us evaluate our outcomes and adapt our restoration practices. And you'll hear more about this data from Sienna later on in the presentation. So how is the project progressing so far? We began implementation back in 2008. And so since then, we've completed smooth brome removal and native seeding on a total of 1,320 acres, which is about 30% of the entire project area. And those are the areas in green that have been seeded. In these green sites, you can see the number which represents the restoration age, or the number of years that have passed since the area was seeded with native plants. You also notice that some of the sites show a range of ages. That's just because we did not seed that particular area all in the same year. The other areas in yellow represent where restoration has not yet been initiated. And those are primarily smooth brome monoculture still. And the blue is the site that we're beginning to restore this year. So back in 2010, almost 11 years ago, in my first couple of weeks working here in Grand Teton, I remember walking around in this site here with a backpack sprayer, spraying musk thistle plants. And I can still remember what it looked like back then. Basically, a sea of weedy annual plants, as you can see here, kind of in the very beginning of its restoration stages. It's really been such a privilege and very fulfilling to watch it change over the years to what it looks like now. So now we see sagebrush establishment out there. See numerous forb species you can see in the photo. There's arrowleaf balsam root, sulfur buckwheat, a lupin right in the middle there. On multiple occasions, I've seen sage grouse and other wildlife using this site and a number of the other sites, including pronghorn, elk, moose, bison. And here's another site at 9 years of age. Definitely noticed a lot less sagebrush, some forb species blooming there, and quite a bit more grasses. And this photo here was taken a little later in the year, so things aren't quite as green in the photo. But again, a little bit of sagebrush and very good grass establishment. And another site at 6 years of age. So in these older sites, some of those last ones I just showed you, we see generally successful native grass establishment. We also notice that seems to be low levels of forbs and shrubs, compared to that intact sagebrush community. So after noticing this in the field, we have made some adjustments going into the newer sites, such as lowering our seeding rates of those native grasses, and acquiring some specialized seeding equipment to improve establishment of those shrub and forb species. And in these newest restoration sites, we noticed some encouraging signs with the emergence of forb and shrub seedlings. Again, the photo on the right makes me pretty excited, but yeah, this photo on the right, you'll notice right down the center row, quite a few sagebrush seedlings and other forbs and shrub seedlings coming up there as well. But we don't really have enough information yet to predict what the outcome will be here in an area like this in 5 years or 10 years. So Amanda Snodgrass, our native plant materials program manager, she's making some major improvements and changes in our seed collection that will certainly improve our seed mixes even more going forward. And I'm definitely really excited to see where that can take us. So in the past 10 years, we've observed in the field, a variety of sometimes unpredictable outcomes from our restoration actions. We recognize the need for a quantitative evaluation of all of our data over time in order to understand the full picture of the plant community in the restoration sites. With that, we would have the ability to adapt our techniques and management actions based on what that data tells us. We want to use every piece of information available to make sound science-based decisions. So in 2020, last year, we began the collaboration with University of Wyoming to dive deep into that data so we can adapt and accelerate the restoration and improve our outcomes, in the next 10 years and beyond. And we've worked closely with Sienna on this effort, and from here on out, she's going to tell you a little bit more about this. Thank you.
Awesome. Thanks so much for the great setup, Eric. And I will get ready to tell you a little bit about what we're finding. Is it okay if I stop your screen share?
Yeah, go ahead.
All right. Okay, how do we look? Good. Awesome. Well, again, thanks so much for setting that up, Eric, because now I'm going to talk to you a little bit about my role as a collaborator at the University of Wyoming and with the park, and using all of these wonderful monitoring data that the park has done such a good job of collecting over this 11-year span. So I'd like you to think of my role as a collaborator as building the sagebrush steppe mosaic. So with this actual mosaic, you can see here that I've built from around 60 species that you find in those intact sagebrush steppe communities. When you step back, you can see the whole big picture of the community. And that's my job, is to take all of these pieces of information from over the years and collect some new information and give us an idea of how these restored communities are changing over time, if we're meeting goals, and what we can alter to improve restoration and recovery going forward. And in this data set, we recorded information on 103 species, which span 27 plant families. So there's quite a high diversity. Sorry, And I'll just take a quick moment to say thank you to all of the people and groups who have invested in this work. You've heard about a few of them already from Laura, but in my work specifically, I've had these groups supporting, and thank you specifically to the Wyoming Native Plant Society, who was a sponsor of this research last year. So when we first came into this project together in collaboration, our broad goal was just to simply assess change over time at this really kind of aerial view of all of these different little units that have been restored, and then decide if they're kind of meeting goals. And then as we've dug into the data, we've also identified two major restoration challenges that apply not just to Grand Teton National Park, but pretty much any restoration project. So Eric kind of mentioned, restoration science is a relatively young science, so there's not always information to go off of when you're practicing restoration that will tell you, oh, do exactly this to get to this endpoint. There's still a lot to learn there. And then additionally, climate change is shifting contexts in the greater Yellowstone ecosystem in the park, and of course globally as well. So what we do today might not hold up tomorrow. And so those are considerations that we're making with this research, all in hopes that it will come together to inform restoration design, increase predictability and recovery, anticipate species losses, and hopefully create some climate stable communities. So for today, I'm just mostly going to focus on this first portion of the work. I'm kind of thinking about community trajectories and what drives them. And so, we had this interest in, are all of these different communities that have been seeded across different years under different conditions following similar trajectories, like converging compositionally with one another towards some end goal? Or are they kind of following their own path over time because of these site-specific things like soil composition, design of the seed mix, and even with some relationship to climate change, weather of the seeding year as well? And we also wanted to think outside of the box a little bit and bring in kind of cutting edge science to this process. So thinking beyond just species abundances and also considering something called functional traits, which are essentially measurable characteristics of plants like leaf area or leaf mass that tell us a lot about ecological strategies of plants, can tell us about potential for establishment, reproduction, and survival, as well as ecological function of the whole community. So for today, I'll just focus on giving you a sneak peek of what we've learned about these trajectories or this change over time in the restored communities, and touch on a couple of the points in those first two questions. And hopefully we'll come back to you again with more on kind of the climate change side and some more final results in the future. So Eric has already kind of given you a walkthrough of some of these wonderful restored units. And, there's kind of a picture that we already have of how change might be happening. But we can also look at this a little bit more quantitatively. So at the bottom here, I'm showing you pictures from a couple of different restoration age classes. So of course, I've looked at change over every single year of restoration, but just for simplicity here, we're looking at the youngest sites, so sites that are 1 to 3 years of age, and then the oldest sites that are 7 to 11 years of age, and then compared to the intact reference. So at the bottom, you can kind of see this broad scale picture of the community and get an idea of the structural changes. You might even see a few species changes. But I've also provided for you 5 of the most dominant species that rank in these communities at these age classes. So you get an idea of how that species composition is changing. And exotic or non-native species are highlighted in red. So in those first years of restoration across all of the sites in that age class, as Eric mentioned, we do see a little bit of a flush of some exotic annual species like pennycress, tansy mustard, and goose pigweed, sorry. But we also do see some of those great native grasses that have been seeded like slender wheatgrass and mountain broom. But then you see a pretty big shift in dominance in that 7 to 11 year age class, where we really start to see some of those species that are common in the intact. Of course, the star of our show, the mountain big sagebrush, we have buckwheat appearing, and even more similarity in grass structure as well, with Idaho fescue showing up. But then on the far right, you see the intact community, and there are still some differences there that we're hoping to reach. There's a little bit more dominance of perennial forms, the lupin and the arrowleaf balsam root, as well as bitter brush that appears in those communities. And as I mentioned, we want to think about this functional trait aspect as well. And so we needed to go out and collect data on functional traits, which we started last year in 2020, and we'll continue this year, this summer. And I've actually collected data on 5 different functional traits, but just for simplicity today, to orient you, I'll give you an idea of 2 of the traits that we've measured. So the first one is turgor loss point, which essentially tells us at which point if a plant wilts, it can no longer recover. And so as you might guess, that relates to drought tolerance, which is an important feature in the community, especially when you're thinking about climate change. So some of our most drought tolerant species, as you might intuitively guess, are grasses like Idaho fescue, shrubs like serviceberry and big sagebrush, all the way to the more drought sensitive end with some of our forbs like arrowleaf balsam root and the non-native goosefoot. And I also want to give a shout out because one of our functional traits, we've gotten data from a couple of collaborative partners who have recently presented for you. So Trevor Bloom with his fantastic phenology project has shared some of his data so that I could calculate earliest flowering dates for our species. And then I filled some of the data gaps with digitized herbarium specimens from the Rocky Mountain Herbarium as well. And so then we can build this gradient of earlier flowering to later flowering species. And that tells us a lot about reproductive strategies and potential for establishment. And so you'll note here that the spring ephemerals are not part of this data set, but that's something we're talking about measuring going forward. And so we have our early flowering, arrowleaf balsam root, all the way to our later flowering mountain big sagebrush. And before I go to the next slide, I'm going to show you just 2 graphs and I'll walk you through it. But they synthesize all of this data on these species abundances and these traits and look across all of these different restored subunits in every year so that we get an overall picture of how trajectories or community change is happening over time. Okay, so what you're looking at, each of these plots is called an ordination. And essentially what that does is it takes all of the records from the restored communities across every age, every year, and all of the intact communities from the inventory and monitoring program, and it compares them one at a time to one another and then rates similarity. So on the left-hand side, we have similarity based on species identities and quantities. And on the right, we have similarity based on those traits that I mentioned. So we've averaged traits at the community level from leaves, flowers, whole plants, and seeds. So then we've added some additional information so that you get an idea of the whole story. So first of all, the closer together points are, the more similar they are, just to start. And second, you can also track an individual site through time this way because we've given them each unique symbols. So if you kind of look at a triangle, you can follow that through time. And then we've shown you that time gradient using a blue color gradient. So the lighter color blue, the younger the restoration, the darker color blue, the older the restoration, until finally you get the darkest blue open circles, which represent that intact or reference community. You'll also note that there's some dotted lines around the intact community. What does that mean? Well, that's just showing you that collaborators with the park in the past have already found that there are 2 intact community subtypes. They're just a little bit different in terms of like shrub composition versus an even grass forb shrub kind of composition. So we wanted to see if communities were moving closer to one or the other. So what are the takeaways? Well, first of all, really exciting. What we see here is that the darker blue points, so the older restored communities, are the closest to the intact in both cases. And it seems as if it doesn't really matter where the communities start out or those site-specific conditions, they still end up coming together on sort of a linear trajectory towards these intact communities. So recovery is happening, which is fantastic. We also can find out a little bit about how that recovery is happening. So you'll notice that in terms of trait composition, recovery is happening faster. So we have younger, lighter blue points that are already overlapping with the intact. So we're meeting some of those functional trait goals really quickly earlier on. Whereas species composition, though we are trajecting towards that, at 10 and 11 years, we're not quite covering the same abundances and identities. And so that can help us to think about how we might set goals going forward in the future, how we might tweak restoration plans to consider particular species or functional traits. So finally, as Laura mentioned, I'm really excited to say that I'm coming back this summer as a scientist and park fellow, and I will be continuing some of the work that I've mentioned to you and answering those remaining questions. But a big push for the work that we're going to do this summer is really communicating the work that's going on in this really awesome large-scale project. So I've already been doing some blogging and photography and video, and we hope to synthesize that together into a multimedia story map that can be shared with the public, with other NPS practitioners, restoration practitioners in general, and then also translating this science into management and monitoring plans as well. So that's all I have for you today, and I'll turn it back to Laura before questions.
Okay. So I just wanted to wrap up and just mention what we're doing this year. We have a lot of plans you might see for that will translate into the future. But just to mention a few things, we have a bunch of returning seasonals that have been working on this project. Mark Pagliariani is coming back for a third season and has been specifically working on this project. Also Jasmine Cutter, Nate Dant, Kayla Mendoza, and Grant Smith. So we're super excited to be seeing them again and having their returning skills and knowledge. Then we have a bunch of new seasonals, about 8 of them, and we're really excited to meet them and see what new things they contribute to our team. We also are engaging work youth crews. We've been working with Montana Conservation Corps. We're going to continue that. And we're also starting to work with American Conservation Experience, or ACE. And so there'll be a crew here for a couple months. We'll have Teton County Weed and Pest working with us and continue our collaboration with University of Wyoming. A couple years out, we're looking at maybe having a graduate student analyzing some of our next steps, so where we're testing our adaptive management. So anyone looking for a graduate student project, we'll be working with Dr. Daniel Laughlin's lab on that. And you know, we're looking for more partners. Collaboration is in our mission and it's in our park strategic goals. And if your goals align with ours and we haven't found you yet, please reach out to us. Also, we have volunteer opportunities this season, which is very exciting. And we'll say native seed collection, cleaning and planting, weed warriors, and sagebrush plug and container planting. And if there's something else that you dream of contributing to the plant world, let us know. You can contact Amanda Snodgrass for that. And just a big thank you again. And thank you to Teton Plants and the Teton County Library. And just so many people have worked on this project in the past and now and in the future. So it's those collaborations that make this really strong. We are all here on the line, including Amanda and Janine, and we welcome any questions or thoughts from you.
Terrific. And what I encourage people to do at this point is, if you have a question, I think given the number of people we have on, is if you could put it in the chat, then we can take those and sort them a little bit and present them in a coherent fashion to our scientists here, the management team. And I have one, I've got, well, several, but one is, what is the role of the annual and biennial sort of weedy species that come in? Do they sort of fade out? Or are they helping to hold the soil? Is there a sort of a positive role that they are providing at the sort of very beginning stages, or are they just a nuisance?
Who do you want to field that?
Maybe Eric has observed a lot of these, and Sienna has seen it in the data. So if either of you want to speak to what you've seen with what persists and what doesn't, and does any of this help?
Yeah, certainly those annual species don't really persist for very long. You know, for a couple of years, you know, in the first year, they're most abundant, and then it kind of declines over the next couple of years. But certainly, I mean, certainly in a more natural plant community, you know, native annual species you know, play an important role. And you know, we're actually that's one of the goals with the seed program is to try and introduce some of those other plant types into our restoration, such as native annual plants.
Yeah, I can definitely echo that. Seeing in the data frame, they definitely don't persist. And I would, we haven't tested it explicitly, but I would gather that, they are filling some sort of a niche and probably keeping out other things that could be coming in. So they're definitely, nothing of concern. That's like a pretty typical trajectory that we see in restoration.
That's good to know. And I have another one which I'm selfishly going to ask, and then there's a couple that are coming in. Thank you, everybody, for putting in your questions. We'll get to them very momentarily. I have a question about mycorrhizal fungi, bacteria, all those kinds of little organisms that are should be part of the soil web. And is there any work, I haven't heard anybody talk about inoculation or soil transfers or anything like that to help bring the soil back, especially after you've removed the exotics and then have herbicided. Could you address that?
Yeah, I asked that same question myself. Like, have we looked at it? Can we look at the soils? So that would be one dream thing, is to analyze the soils for that. But it hasn't risen up in priority at this time. And if anybody out there has done work with this, we'd like to know about it and know if people have thoughts on that.
Okay, terrific. I have a question here from John Hebiger, who heads up our geology group on other Tuesday nights. Nature nights at the library are Tuesday nights, and he takes two with the geologist of Jackson Hole, but he's becoming more involved with birds and plants. And his question is, could you ask how much damage was done by the rogue bikers of last fall? Has that problem persisted? Do you know yet what that damage may be? We had some people run amok last year.
Yeah, we had some, for those who weren't tuned in, we had some dirt bikers that kind of ran a track around one of our restoration sites that was just 1 year after seeding. So there was a lot of, not much plant establishment, not much root zone establishment. And so that rendered that more bare ground. And our team went out and documented the damage. And it's kind of set some of that area back another year because we reseeded it. But knowing what the damage is in the long term is kind of, we'll see.
Okay, thank you. And Mike Morigliano, U.S. Forest Service, and long ago and still on it in very many ways and trying to figure things out. Have the pocket gophers increased as smooth brome decreases and natives, I guess, increase? It's a sign of pocket gophers out there.
Yeah, and one of the photos in my presentation of that oldest restoration site at 11 years old, you can actually see in the foreground of that photo quite a bit of pocket gopher activity, and which is not something I've noticed in the smooth brome dominated areas or in the very new restoration sites. So we've definitely noticed it and seen it, a definite increase in that in our oldest restoration sites, which is interesting. And even several years ago when I was out there in the winter, I saw a fox scurrying around on top of the snow, hunting for those pocket gophers. Got to see him do the head first dive into the snow. So that was cool to see.
And I understand certainly in the higher meadows, their activity can be very important in stirring up the soils and aerating it and adding to the diversity. So we'll see what happens with those. That's fascinating to know. Abigail, let's see. Is there anything you can do specifically to increase the fire resilience?
Yeah, so I guess I could speak to that for a second. So that's not something I'm looking at explicitly, at least in my portion of work, but I do know that the more sagebrush, the more native plants, the more moisture retention there is. And so that kind of cheatgrass sagebrush fire cycle is sort of flared up when you have decreased cover of native species, when you know that after that first major burn that just destroys everything. So definitely the more native species, the more it's going to hold moisture and prevent fire. I mean, from my perspective, I don't know, Laura and Eric, if you have more thoughts on that for the specific area.
Yeah, I mean, treating the weeds that can promote fire, the invasive, the flashy fuels, the invasive grasses, and we work with the park, with the interagency fire ecologist and fire crew, and talking about how this, because we might be looking at that on a larger scale as well. So if you take actions to prevent fires from becoming larger, is that like, how would we do that? How do we want to do that on a landscape where sagebrush is very valuable, but you also want to avoid these large fires that could eliminate a very large swath of sagebrush, of mature sagebrush. So maybe treatments to minimize the potential impact of very large fires.
And this one's a bit of a follow-up, and I'm stepping right along in here. Trevor Bloom, who is a colleague of yours and doing some more monitoring work with restoration plants up by the museum, he's wondering if there's been sort of any quantification of the difference in the wildlife use of the restoration sites and over the changes over time.
Yeah,
is that being monitored, and what are you seeing?
Yeah, there was a study a few years ago with birds, and Dr. Anna Kelfoon and another researcher, and they found that when they looked at restored sites and non-restored pasture grassland and intact sagebrush, they had 3 very different communities. So the bird communities were not yet approximating the intact sagebrush. And at that time, this was a few years ago. So at that time, there was very little shrub cover in and still there's not a lot of shrub cover. So you're still seeing more grassland birds in the restored sites. And beyond that, we haven't had the research, and I'm really interested to see that. I think you would see more of a response on maybe some of the smaller, or I think looking at pollinators, and then these smaller mammals, like you mentioned, the gophers, where you can observe that and you can start to see that and maybe measure that functionality coming back. And then the larger fauna, we would like to see maybe a few years down the road in conjunction with our wildlife staff, where are the elk, bison, where are they spending their time, and that are the subject of the elk bison management plan, but also pronghorn, moose, and a lot of the other wildlife that we see out there. We'd be very curious to see where they're spending their time. So that will be to come someday.
And somebody's also questioning about what's happening with the insects. Are they providing challenges on some things are more, or actually all the wildlife, or some things that are more palatable than others? And is this having a problem? And I remember the bison getting into one of the earlier patches, and that was difficulty. But are you finding that they are taking their toll of certain species?
Was that insects or?
I'm sorry, it was actually the wildlife herbivory overall.
Herbivory, great.
So that's probably loops back to your original, haven't quite done it yet.
Yeah, and maybe Eric can speak to what he's seen in like observationally, because we don't have data on like what grazing and the bare ground impacts, but we have seen it. So what do you say, Eric?
Yeah, Yeah, I mean, definitely, as far as insects, not as much. There have been a few years where the grasshoppers are seem to be in pretty good numbers and are definitely eating a lot of the grasses, but haven't seen significant impacts yet. As far as we definitely have had challenges with bison herbivory in the past. Again, yeah, we can't quantify that, but certainly in the oldest restoration sites, yeah, we definitely had a significant bison herbivory, and we actually erected a temporary fence around some of that area to try and exclude them and let the native plants become established and become more resilient. And observationally, that kept the bison out and a lot of the native grasses established. So it seemed that helped. But yes, certainly something on my mind a lot when I'm out there, especially in the very young areas where the bison are spending extended periods of time.
Great, thank you. We're getting lots of good questions here. Here's more of a technical one. Can you tell us a little bit more about the methods used for collecting your species composition data and any lessons learned with picking your protocol now that you're getting deeper into the analysis? Woohoo.
Do you want me to field this one?
I think you're on top of it.
Yeah, so this was actually like a pretty big question. I mean, even though I didn't put that on my slide of big questions, I think that's actually been a really big question of ours, because when I came into this data, it wasn't necessarily designed a priori for me to come and analyze. So there were actually several data sets that included different facets and things. And so we've since compared those data sets to understand what they capture better than one another. Maybe some capture more richness or more number of species, and others quantify total plant cover more. And so now we're working, and that's one of the major things I'll be doing now and into the Scientists in Parks Fellowship, is helping to develop new approaches to the monitoring plans. And so I think we're doing what we can to stick with some of the methods we use now, which are intercept transects in the restored community. So it's essentially a tape measure that you put out, and every so far you look at a point and you collect data on exactly what that point touches, exactly what species are captured there. And then that can be converted to cover data. So like 30% of this species, 40% of that species. And so I think we're going to try and retain that going forward, but adjust some of the methodology in terms of timing and quantity of effort, so number of transects and units. And so, yeah, there have been some challenges there, but I think it's been really exciting to think about what we can do going forward, so that the next person 10 years from now who does what I'm doing will have even more data to work with.
Terrific, terrific. We have a few more questions. We're just after 6 o'clock. So if anybody needs to go off, actually 7 o'clock your time. So if anybody needs to leave, you're forgiven. Don't feel you're being impolite, but let's capture a few more of these questions if we can. I had one here. Got a lot about animals and what's happening out there. One though is, I got two here I'd like to make sure we do. One is, have there been plants coming in on their own that, let's say, are not the invasive species, but the ones that are natural to the area? Are they coming in on their own now? And which ones?
A little bit. Do we see that in the data, Sienna?
Yeah, definitely. So I actually had quantified that at one point. I don't think that has stayed in like my final analysis. But definitely there has been recruitment other than seeded species, and it sort of depends on the site, because each site was also seeded a little differently. I'm trying to think offhand exactly. So like, I think we've seen like Microceros, which is like the nodding, is it nodding dandelion? I'm so bad with common names, I'm sorry. So we've seen that one. We've seen, I have seen phlox in some sites that weren't seeded. I've seen definitely native grasses that have moved in on their own as well. So there's been kind of a variety, and it hasn't really been limited to one species, but I would say, you know, shrubs aren't necessarily establishing on their own. So I think that's a known effort that needs to be made to keep up with things.
And
Yeah,
it's really important. Sorry, it's really important. I mean, that's a function, that's an ecosystem function, is to have the ability to recruit new species and on their own. So that's a sign of restoration that is worth looking at a little bit more. And Eric and I went out early season, and we saw a lot of species at this one site. And it prompts us to say, well, we monitor at the peak vegetation, but what's happening with those spring ephemerals and some other species we might be missing. So Eric, what did we see out there? It was really fascinating.
Yeah. So, and yeah, this was anecdotal observation, so can't necessarily extrapolate it out to the area as a whole, but yeah, kind of in this best looking area, that in the oldest restoration unit, just walking around for 30 minutes or so, we did actually count 20 native species that were not seeded on the site, including like spring beauties, sagebrush buttercups, and larkspur. And these were kind of near the fringes of this area. So I think there's certainly potential, and certainly that observational evidence of native species starting to move in on their own.
Terrific, terrific. And somebody also asked, and this is a segue to the being grass dominated in some of these sites that you're talking about. Are there possible interventions to boost the forb shrub cover in some of these grass dominated restoration sites? I know you've adjusted some of your seeding to allow for more of them to germinate in the first place, but if you already have a spot where the grasses have become pretty dominant, what are you doing about that situation?
Amanda,
anything?
Juan, I wonder if you want to answer what you have in mind, what you want to try for sites that have been restored, but we want to boost the forb and shrub component.
Sure. Hi, everyone. Nice to meet all of you. I hope you can see me. I'm up here in the park and my internet is not great. Yeah, so that is something that we have noticed and that we have started to talk about, is that we have gone back into these areas and we have essentially been very successful at excluding non-native species and establishing native species. But we see that there is a heavy component of grasses that does not mimic that intact diversity that we see. So one of the things, well, we're actually talking about a lot of things. And we've started to talk about things such as demonstration plots, areas where we can go in and thin that grass using either mechanical methods such as plowing, and then doing a secondary seeding over the top that is specifically focused on forbs, shrubs, and annual wildflower species. Areas where we can put in seed plots that are very heavily dominated by forbs and shrubs, and then to do some tilling around those areas. And we've started to look at moving in that direction, but we haven't decided on anything yet. So I'm hopeful that in the next few years, you'll see some of that coming into these parts of Antelope Flats that we've previously worked on 2, 5, 10 years ago. As Sienna's talked about, we do see a natural succession to greater diversity over time. And so with that in mind, as these units age, we can go back into those and maybe add more seed, add more species, and help to boost that diversity. But those are conversations that we're having. I think those are exciting problems that we've begun addressing. And we have some new partners that we've begun to talk to who are addressing similar issues on other federal lands and state lands across the state of Wyoming who deal with a lot of native grass restoration. So I hope that answers a little bit. And we would love any feedback or ideas that anybody here has as we move into this kind of creative stage and revisiting some of those sites.
Terrific. I have two more questions I'm going to ask of you. When investigating the native soils, have you found old creek beds or natural land drainage versus the current man-made drainages? So what's going on underneath all of this? Is it mostly the man-made issues that you're trying to put back, or is there some natural drainages that you're also finding under there that's affecting things?
Well, I guess I can say just briefly. So from my perspective for soil analysis, I've mainly been using so far soil maps. So NRCS soil maps and then deriving data from there. But this summer we are planning to do soil sampling to get more on like specifics on pH and bulk density and things like that. So that is one side thing. Otherwise, at least as far as I know, it seems like it's mainly the man-made drainages, but there is a kind of hydrology gradient, and forgive me because I'm not specialized in that area, but I remember Simeon Kasky talking about, along the edge of Blacktail Butte, the soils there definitely are more moisture retaining than those farther out. So there is a gradient of what's going on with the soil that I think definitely can be playing a role anecdotally and what I'm seeing in some preliminary data analysis too, driving the communities. But I'll leave that open to Laura and Eric as well.
Any other comments from you two about the soils? Okay, we've got one other. And how can the summer National Park visitors volunteer as weed warriors? Can a whole family help for a day or two? So this opens up and invites ways that those of us who are on this evening and people who are receiving our Teton plants bulletins, how can we pitch in here, folks? Does that go to
Amanda?
Amanda?
Hello again. Yeah, we have a lot of opportunities this year, and you can volunteer as an individual or as a family or as an organized group for a day, for a season, for just Saturdays once a month. If you or someone who's interested, and specifically for Weed Warriors or any of the opportunities that we have, go ahead and shoot me an email. And my email address is Amanda_Snodgrass. It's in the chat at mps.gov, and I will get you set up and work with scheduling you to work with either our crews or one of our field leads or myself or Janine, and have whatever opportunities you're interested in available. So just shoot me an email and we'd be happy and would love to have anyone come and work with our program throughout the year.
Terrific. Thank you, Amanda. And we'll make sure that email address is up for people to see on our next email blast. And also, I know Trevor's been looking for some volunteers as well. So we'll just make sure that those of us who are going to be here this summer and want some way of contributing to our native plants, that you are aware of those possibilities. And at this point, I just want to extend my appreciation to all of you who participated tonight in presenting the team, the revegetation restoration team out there, because it's so clear it takes a lot of different disciplines and a sort of interaction in order to make these very complicated projects come to pass. And it's such a treat to see the progress that's out there and to know that you are able to do it with more and more adjustments as you learn, but that it's trending definitely in the right direction. And that you have such an impressive team coming on this year with added people to help out. And my hat's off to the National Park Service for enabling this to happen and all those other cooperators that you listed in the beginning. But a big thank you from all of us who participated tonight to all of you presenters for helping us understand what a task you're out there doing. So thank you, thank you.
Thank you so much, Frances, for hosting, as well as Amy and Leah again, and again, everybody in the audience. We just really appreciate being able to communicate our story, and communicating is two ways. So really reach out and let us know if you have ideas or want to work with us.
Good, we will do that. And the thing about Zoom is you can't all applause and do all this great thank you, so you know, and we all leave meeting and that sort of a end. But thank you again, everybody, and I think we'll do the leave meeting, as impersonal as that feels. So thank you, and Leah, thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Thank you for such
Everybody.
awesome